Archives of Prasar Bharati presents the timeless treasure of golden era.
Sir, could you tell something more about this Public Law 480 Act provisions, the conditions under which we got this wheat loan, and what happened to this Public Law 480 rupees? Large funds are left back in India. What happened to them?
That's correct. Public Law 480 or PL 480 as it's called, as its name indicates, it's a law of the United States Congress. It provides for concessional sales of food grains to countries which are in need of such assistance and can establish that they need this assistance. And in the case of India, it was not very difficult to establish that need. In addition, it provided that normal channels of trade should not be disrupted, which means that the Department of Agriculture in the United States had to be satisfied that what India would normally have bought by way of wheat, let us say, from Canada or Australia, which was a small quantity, we would continue to buy them. These were the requirements. Now, the financing arrangement was like this. They sent us, my negotiation was for 1 million tons of wheat.
Yeah.
The value in dollars was $365 million. Because at that time, the cost of a ton of wheat was $365. Now, this $365 million was paid in Indian rupees and paid into an account called the Counterpart Funds Account. This Counterpart Funds Account was at the disposal of the United States government for use in India for its own purposes with the prior agreement of the government of India. And as a result, as you know, the United States Embassy in Delhi, for example, was built with this money. But the resources available were so enormous. Over a period of time, this counterpart funds became a burden. And ultimately, I think a couple of years ago, they were written off. So that is the story of the counterpart funds.
So I'm so glad that what could not be achieved in 1950, you were able to deal with that and successfully get the wheat.
The reason for that was very simple. The conditions were right.
Right.
There was a surplus of wheat in the United States. They were anxious to get rid of it. We needed the wheat and we got it. You see. As it happened, at that time, Deshmukh, my very dear finance minister, had resigned on the issue of a separate state for Maharashtra. He resigned on the 1st of July, 1956. On the 7th of July, the cabinet approved a separate state for Maharashtra.
Yes.
All he had to do was to wait for one more week and he could have seen this happen. But so the result was, I had to present to the cabinet my paper on Public Law 480 agreement with the government of the United States to the cabinet when Panditji was the acting finance minister.
Holding charge.
So since Panditji was the finance minister, there was no discussion. The discussion, I was present at the cabinet meeting. The cabinet meeting is, Narasimhan has it's approved, you can go. So I left, you see. The division bell was also ringing in the house of Lok Sabha at that time. He went away. And I signed the Public Law 480 agreement with the US ambassador at that time. His name was Ambassador Allen.
Hello.
And this was my last service to India before I left for the United Nations.
Yes. I would like to start by asking you one personal question, because in 1946 itself, you were invited to join the then just emerging Secretariat of the United Nations. I think it was under formation, but you did not decide to accept the offer at that time. But exactly 10 years, 1956, when the offer came, you accepted it. What made you to change your opinion about this? What made you really to go in for the United Nations and take that very exciting and challenging assignment?
It's a good question, because in 1946, when the United Nations Secretariat was just being put together, the establishment officer of the Government of India was a former Madras cadre ICS officer. He was still a serving ICS officer, but he had gone to the central government. The establishment officer is the man who takes care of all appointments, postings and transfers. And his name was B.G. Holdsworth, a very fine man. He had been Revenue Secretary in the Madras Secretariat, and he went to the central government as establishment officer. He knew me personally. Now, I forgot to mention to you, when I was discussing my ICS career, that in January 1946, on 1st January 1946, I became a member of the British Empire. I was awarded the MBE.
Is it?
In 1946, when I had not even completed 9 years in the service. I was the youngest ever
Member of the British Empire.
to be so recognized. And Holdsworth was aware of all these things. In other words, I had a rather outstanding record in the Madras Secretariat as a civil servant. And that's how he sent this letter to me because they were looking for outstanding civil servants from all over the world. But perhaps, first of all, the time had not come. You know, every man has a destiny to fulfill, however humble it might be. And secondly, perhaps it was a good thing. Because to mention one example, a colleague of mine called Charles Coates, who was actually my senior in the service, he went to the United Nations Secretariat in 1947, a year later, when India became independent and many ICS officers had to choose some other career. Of course, all of them were assured a place in the Home Civil Service or in the British Foreign Service. But some of them opted for the United Nations. Coates was one of them. And when 10 years later, I went as Undersecretary in the United Nations, Coates was 2 levels junior to me. He was only Deputy Director. Perhaps it meant that if I had gone at that time, I would have just gone through the ranks and reached a much lower position than the position at which I was recruited. But in a very real sense, I would say my becoming a United Nations official was the hand of destiny at work. Because in January of 1956, I had been slated to go to the World Bank as Executive Director for India, which was my normal posting. This had been approved by Mr. Deshmukh, it had been approved by the Cabinet, and that did not happen for a variety of reasons which I have disclosed in my book entitled Recollections. And then Hammarskjöld happened to come, Krishnamenon happened to meet me, and he decided that I was the right person to go to the United Nations, and all the things that I mentioned, all those came to pass. Surely that was the hand of destiny at work. And that destiny was, in my case, incarnated in the form of Krishnamenon. Now, in this country, Krishnamenon has many admirers, he has many detractors. But I am an admirer of his, not because he was the man who changed my whole career and made me go away from the Ministry of Finance and my specialized interest in the financial and economic administration to the much broader field represented by the United Nations Secretariat. I can never thank him enough for the tremendous change in my whole life that Krishnamenon brought about. And as we recalled yesterday, you remember that within 24 hours of his having seen Hammarskjöld and being requested by him to get the Government of India to agree to my being seconded to work in the United Nations Secretariat, within 24 hours he was able to meet Nehru and N.R. Pillai, and the telegram went to the Secretary General saying we agree to release Mr. Narasimhan for appointment as Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East. This is, if anything, the hand of destiny at work.
After getting going to
I went first to Bangkok.
Yes, first Bangkok, and then afterwards, of course, went to New York, and you occupied a number of positions, sometimes holding dual positions, dual responsibilities, as a matter of fact. So we would like to know what are the various positions which you occupied, and what kind of responsibilities and duties were attached to that office, and how you were able to discharge yourself so splendidly in all those responsibilities. But maybe first beginning with the Executive Secretary as the ECFA.
Yes.
And there I am told that you are known as the father of the Mekong River. You had a particular plan to develop the Mekong River Valley system for the benefit of those 4 nations. So I think that was a very great, even as such a young age, you were able to conceive a kind of international river valley development system, and you were able to persuade those 4 nations to how did it happen? Your persuasive powers and all these things.
The reason for my going to Bangkok in 1956 was because Hammarskjöld had pleaded with the Government of India that he did not have a suitable vacancy for me at the highest levels in the United Nations Secretariat in New York, headquarters. But he had given an undertaking, not in writing, but orally to Krishnamenon, that at the earliest opportunity he would bring me to New York. And I have detailed the circumstances of my invitation to go to New York at great length in my book, Recollections. This happened in October 1958, when I had been in ECFA for 2 years. And he fulfilled his promise to the Government of India. And that's how I went to New York. But before that, I must tell you, I thoroughly enjoyed my sojourn in ECFA. First of all, my whole administrative experience had been as a high-level economic administrator and negotiator, bringing governments together at the highest levels. And the Mekong was a river which was waiting to be developed. The Mekong is really a corruption for Maha Ganga. In Thai language and so on, Ka becomes Ga and Ga becomes Ka. That's very common. And the Mahaganga or Mekong is the 7th largest river in the world. Many people do not know it. And before my time, several attempts had been made to harness the resources of the Mekong, but it was I who had the grand design in my head that we must bring these 4 countries together. The 4 riparian countries were Vietnam, now called Vietnam, but at that time it was South Vietnam, because that's where the Mekong Delta is. What we now call Kampuchea, but it was then called Cambodia. And Laos.
Yes.
And of course Thailand. So far as Thailand is concerned, Mekong was just a border river. But if there was any hydroelectric development at that point, Thailand would also be a beneficiary. So the 4 countries involved were these 4: Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Not the Vietnam of today, but the Vietnam of those days, you see. And South Vietnam, as it was then called. The whole point was, I got them in my very first session of the Economic Commission in 1957, March, April 1957, to pass a resolution saying that these 4 countries wish to cooperate in the development of the Mekong, and calling upon the Executive Secretary to give all proper help. With that, I could unlock all doors. I could get some money from the United Nations Technical Assistance Administration. I could engage a man who became my lifelong friend even before, when I was in the Central Tractor Organization of the Government of India, General Raymond A. Wheeler. His first name was Raymond A. Wheeler. He was called Spec Wheeler. Now, Spec Wheeler had actually been Deputy Supreme Commander of SEAC, the Southeast Asia Command under Mountbatten. Mountbatten was the Supreme Commander, and he was his deputy. He was the head of the Army Corps of Engineers in the United States, which is responsible for all bridges, dams, water development, and so on. And I invited him to head a team, and because I was the invitor, he joined, he lent his name to the team, and that's the starting of this Mekong development. The Wheeler Report, as it was called. The Wheeler Report starts with the saying, the Mekong is a majestic river. That's how he began. And that was the level at which he did that whole report. And the result was, after that, I had the governments eating out of my hands. The first contribution came from France, because after all, 3 of the riparian countries, Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam, were former French colonies. And before long, we had enough money to do all the project work that we needed to do for investigation purposes and so on. And I am glad to say, as I have recalled in my book towards the very end, that the projects are now going forward in full strength, because these 4 countries are again at peace, including Cambodia, where there was long period of this Khmer Rouge upsetting situation and so on. So I feel very pleased that I was able to do that. But even so, when the request came from Hammarskjöld, now I invite you to come to New York. I did go to New York in October of 1958. We agreed on a timetable that I'd report for duty in January 1959, but I would still remain as Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission until our commission meeting in 1959 was over. The commission meetings are held by rotation amongst host governments. And Australia was a member of the Economic Commission for Asia, and Australia invited us to hold that meeting. And R.G. Casey was a very well-known man. He had been Governor of Bengal during World War II. He was the Foreign Minister of Australia, and he presided over the meeting, and we became very good friends as a result of that. And after that meeting was over, I went to New York and started my work in the Secretariat.
Who were your counterparts in other regional
That's a very good question. I am glad you asked me that question, because I had a distinction which is unique. All my colleagues got the Nobel Prize, not me. My colleague in the Economic Commission for Europe was Gunnar Myrdal. He got the Nobel Prize for Economics. My colleague as Under Secretary for Special Political Affairs, which is the position at which I joined, was Ralph Bunche. He was a Nobel Prize holder. I replaced, in due course I'll mention, a man called Arthur Lewis, another economist, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics. And the Economic Commission for Europe was Gunnar Myrdal, a very famous Swedish economist. His wife Alva Myrdal was very active in the disarmament field. She got the Nobel Prize for Peace.
She was an ambassador here.
Yes, Alva was our ambassador here. She got the Nobel Prize for Peace for her work in the disarmament field. And the Economic Commission for Latin America, it was called ECLA, was presided over by Raul Prebisch, who became later on the founder of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD.
That's a very distinguished company of people. who are holding similar
Yes.
job in other parts of the regions of the world.
When I joined in New York in 1959 January, I started my work on a very auspicious day, our Republic Day,
26th.
26 January 1959. It was a Monday. That's the day I joined the United Nations Secretariat at headquarters. My designation was Under Secretary for Special Political Affairs. Ralph Bunch was the other Under Secretary. At the same time, Paul Hoffman joined as the designation was Managing Director. Managing Director of the United Nations Special Fund. The United Nations Special Fund was set up to give assistance to pre-investment projects in developing countries. It started with some very modest resources, about $26 million, but under Paul Hoffman's leadership, it became a very big institution. Paul Hoffman was a great institution builder. He had been the head of the motor company called Studebaker in the days before World War II, and then after World War II, he was a close friend of General Marshall, who became Secretary of State. He had been Secretary of Defense. He had been, of course, the top field marshal in the US Army. And he made a speech in Harvard which established what was called the Marshall Plan.
Yes.
The Marshall Plan was to help the ravaged economies of Europe after World War II to reconstruct and recover with the help of massive assistance, both capital and technical, from the United States.
Yes.
And Paul Hoffman made his reputation as the administrator of that fund. Now, I met many distinguished Americans in my time, but Paul Hoffman was like a father to me. I have never met a man who had that combination of common sense, driving ability, and dedication to a nobler purpose. He was an astonishing person, and I was very, very fond of him. Now, when I first met him, we became very good friends. The first Deputy Managing Director of the United Nations Special Fund was Arthur Lewis. Arthur Lewis was at that time a professor in Princeton, but having established the ground rules for giving aid to developing countries for particular projects and so on, he went back to academia. And Paul Hoffman invited me to join him to do double duty. It was not quite the first of my double duties, because when I joined in January, I was already Executive Secretary still. But later that year in July, I became the Associate Managing Director of the United Nations Special Fund. 2 jobs, but no additional responsibilities, but no additional salary or anything like that. In the government of India, when additional charge, they give you 1/4 or 1/3 or whatever it is of the other. Nothing like that in the United Nations. So I continued to draw my salary as Under Secretary, but I had the privilege of working very closely with Paul Hoffman and developing the United Nations Special Fund. That Under Secretary for Special Political Affairs went on for almost 2 years.
Your assignment.
From 59 to 1961, middle of 61. Not 2 years, a year and a half. Now what happened was, a little over 2 years. During that time, I was working with Paul Hoffman also we're in the same building, upstairs on the 38th floor, downstairs on 29th floor, that's all. Then in January 1961, a very important, I must mention, of course, in 1960, the Congo had erupted, and the largest peacekeeping operation of the United Nations with 20,000 troops was in the Congo.
But we will come to that later, when we are discussing this peacekeeping up, big chunk of your responsibility. I think we cannot incidentally deal with that.
Yes, but the reason for my mentioning that is, because of the work I was able to do to assist Hammarskjöld in that Congo peacekeeping operation, he made me his chef de cabinet in June 1961. And I continued in that capacity through Hammarskjöld, through U Thant, and through Oldham. I don't think anyone has held that position under 3 Secretaries General as I did.
So you had the distinction of having worked with the 3 Secretaries General of the United Nations.
Yes, very closely.
And also you are the only Indian who could rise to that kind of high position next to the Secretary General's position. I think you are the only Indian or Asian for that matter.
No, I was only Indian, other Asians also. But by and large, I had a very special relationship with the Secretary General. I was the number 2 man, recognized by everybody, and so on, you see. Now you are talking about the various capacities which I held. The next important thing that happened was Mr. Andrew Cordier, who had been the Executive Assistant to the Secretary General, he left in January 1962 to head the School of International Studies in Columbia University. Later on, he became the President of Columbia University. Although it was past the age of retirement, mind you, General Eisenhower, he was President of Columbia University. Talk about the people with at whose level I worked, you see. And he ran the General Assembly also. He was also Under Secretary for General Assembly Affairs. I took over that responsibility in January 1962. So for 7.5 years, my double duty was General Assembly and also Chef de Cabinet.
So, what are the functions of the Cabinet and the General Assembly?
The Chef de Cabinet is the number 2 in the organization.
Always,
He is in charge of the entire administration of the Secretariat. The division of responsibility between the Secretary General and I myself was all the diplomatic work the Secretary General did. That is relations with embassies, missions and so on. So I was the man who ran the Secretariat on behalf of the Secretary General. Of course, every time I took a decision, it had been approved in advance by the Secretary General. And there were hardly any occasions when there was any difference of opinion between the two of us. So sometimes my colleagues might not like having to take an order from me, but in every case I made it very clear to them in advance, it's not I who is asking for this, it's the Secretary General who is asking for this. And if there's any doubts on the subject, he can go straight to the Secretary General and ask him that same question.
So would you say that it was similar between the Chief Secretary of State and the Chief Minister?
Not quite, because the Chief Secretary and the Chief Minister are two different people. The Chief Secretary is a civil servant and the Chief Minister is a politician. In the case of the Secretary General is also a member of the Secretariat. Article 97 of the Charter says he shall be the Chief Administrative Officer of the Secretariat. He is part of the Secretariat, the Secretary General. He is the Chief Administrative Officer. And I was the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer of the Secretariat. But so far as these diplomatic responsibilities are concerned, whenever the Secretary General had diplomatic function to perform and he could not go personally, he deputed me.
Any instances, Mr. Narasimhan? Recall some of those deputations.
Any number of occasions when I would go to a member state, for example, which had invited the Secretary General for an official visit. In fact, I visited about 20 countries in Africa on behalf of the Secretary General, and I had the opportunity to visit several African countries and to see how well endowed they are in terms of natural resources and human resources, and what a wonderful future they could have under the proper circumstances. Any number of instances like that. But basically, the occasions were, for example, I ran the entire United Nations Temporary Executive Authority in West Irian, and I was the man who was doing the negotiations behind the scenes with with Holland, with the Netherlands and Indonesia. The official representative of the Secretary General was Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, who had been the last ambassador in South Vietnam. He was the man who did the official negotiations, but the Secretary General relied upon me to look after that. So I was there all the time. Of course, my most notable occasion for assisting Secretary General was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he depended entirely upon me for my advice and for preparing the documentation required by the two parties. The Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in 1962, October 24th, United Nations Day. It so happened that the United States reconnaissance, aerial reconnaissance, had shown the presence of equipment capable of launching intermediate range, not intercontinental, those are called ICBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, which could hit any part of the United States from Cuba. And these missiles were of Russian origin. And as a matter of fact, some boats, some ships from the United States were going towards Cuba carrying more of these launchers and equipment and so on. And at that stage, the United States placed an embargo on all, in other words, a naval blockade of Cuba. And the two countries, the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were in a situation what you might call eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation. And Wu Thant was the man who diffused that crisis. I prepared all the drafts for him. In fact, he used to ask for a draft and I used to produce it in 5 minutes. He called me the great dictator at that time because I could dictate a draft just like that onto the typewriter. And his request was to Khrushchev to stop those boats, those cargo boats in mid-ocean and get them back. And to the United States formally to lift the naval blockade and to give time. This was done. As a result of this, the confrontation was avoided. In fact, October 24th was a Wednesday. October 24th, 62 was a Wednesday, that was United Nations Day. And that same Saturday, 3 days later, there was a false alarm that these missiles were going to be launched. And the United States was poised for an air strike on those missiles. Robert McNamara was the Defense Secretary at that time. He has disclosed all these things. But fortunately, that did not happen. But this had nothing to do with my responsibilities as General Assembly, because running the General Assembly was a very interesting business. Mostly the Assembly ran itself. The election of the President of the Assembly is based on a geographical rotation system. For example, the first year I took over, 1962, the retiring General Assembly President was Monji Slim. And his successor was Zafrullah Khan, because the turn of Asia to provide the President of the General Assembly. The previous Asian had been Vijayalakshmi Pandit. And so the Zafrullah Khan mentioned in my recollections, when he was asked how does it feel to have 3 Asians on the podium of the General Assembly, meaning Uthant, myself and himself, he said, not only are we 3 Asians, at the time of our birth we were all citizens of the same country, India, at the time of our birth.
Exactly.
He said that. And the General Assembly runs itself to a very large extent. There's a well-established procedure for running it. But there were very interesting occasions in the General Assembly. For example, in 1962, we put through the General Assembly, apart from the Security Council, the establishment of the temporary executive authority of the United Nations in West Irian. And West Irian was a disputed territory between Netherlands and Indonesia, Netherlands having been the previous metropolitan power. And whether it was part of the Indonesian Empire, Dutch East Indies Empire, was the question. Anyhow, Dutch were not willing to hand over to Indonesia. They had no use for the territory. It was a matter of prestige. So we allowed for a situation where the Dutch flag was brought down, the United Nations flag went up, we held temporary executive authority for October, November, December, January, March, April, 7 months. And on the 1st of May, I represented the Secretary General. You asked me, well, the occasions when I represented. I represented the Secretary General and handed over West Irian, it's now called Irian Bharat, which means the same thing, handed it over on a plate to Sukarno. And Sukarno, Indonesia, took over the territory as part of its own territory. And this was put to the General Assembly. Then, of course, in 1964, we had what was called the Article 19 controversy. Article 19 controversy means that if a country owes more than 2 years of its financial obligations to the United Nations, it cannot vote in the Assembly. It does not mean it's not a member. It cannot vote in the Assembly. Now, as it happened, both the Soviet Union and France were delinquent on the 2-year rule because they had both refused to pay the Congo peacekeeping charges on account of what they called a question of principle. And if you had forced the issue, and the United States itself did not want to force the issue, if you had forced the issue, there had been a showdown. So I had to run the entire General Assembly, the 19th session, without having resort to a single vote. Because if a decision is adopted by consensus, there is no question. So every decision was adopted by consensus. That was also the year that Guevara, representing Cuba, Guevara came to the General Assembly to address the Assembly, and we had been told that there was going to be an attempt on his life in the General Assembly itself. And the President of the General Assembly was a distinguished diplomat from Ghana called Kwezan Saki. And he said, CV, supposing that assassin misses Guevara and hits me, because you see he was sitting just above the speaker, you see. I said to him, Alex, don't worry, this man is supposed to be a crack shot. He is certainly not going to miss Guevara if he has a chance. But we stopped all conducted tours. The press gallery was vacant, the public gallery was vacant, no one was admitted that day under my instructions. And that passed peacefully. But these people, these Cuban emigres, they went to the other side of the river, across East River. And from there they fired 2 shells from 2 bazookas. Fortunately, the bazookas had very poor sighting mechanism, and both those shells fell about 10 feet short of the United Nations into the East River.
Buildings.
So we were really saved that day from a major attack on the United Nations. Then, of course, in 1965, my president was Amintore Fanfani, who had been Prime Minister of Italy many times, but at that time was Foreign Minister. And it was during that time that His Holiness Pope Paul VI visited the United Nations. That was a great occasion for me. So it went on. I had a very interesting time and so on. But in 1969, a crisis arose in the administration of the UNDP. Now, the UNDP had been formed 4 years earlier in 1965 by the combination or merging of 2 separate programs. One was the special fund of which Paul Hoffman was the head. The other was called the United Nations Technical Assistance Board, which was in charge of technical assistance programs. Now, I pointed out to you already that the special fund was not technical assistance, it was pre-investment assistance. That's a stage higher, involving much more massive contribution of funds, because the technical assistance meant just experts, equipment and fellowships.
Yeah.
The two were merged together to form the United Nations Development Program. Today it's the largest source of multilateral grant assistance to the entire developing world.
That merger took place during your...
I was the author of that merger.
You were the author of that.
In 1964. In 65, Paul Hoffman became the first head of that, and in 69, he wanted a deputy, because when it was merged, our friend David Owen was the head of the technical assistance program. He was not the deputy, he was not called the deputy administrator, he was called the joint administrator or associate administrator. He was a Britisher, he was knighted, he became Sir David Owen, and he became the head of the Planned Parenthood, World Federation of Planned Parenthood programs in London. So Paul was desperately looking for someone to take over as deputy, and he requested me to lend my services, and Uthant agreed. So for 3 years, 2.5 years, I did double duty as deputy administrator of UNDP. I'll have more to say that when we talk about development. And that was the last time I did double duty. But it's a very, very important responsibility, because we were able to change the entire orientation of the UN Development Program from the original ideas which Paul Hoffman had developed to the new ideas, which involved basically that each country had a right to a certain percentage of the resources available to the UNDP. And those resources were called the indicative planning figure for that particular country in dollar terms. And that country had the right to decide how those funds were to be used. Not the headquarters in their wisdom, not the bureaucratic wisdom of headquarters, but that country. And in each country, there was a resident representative of the UN Development Program. He assisted that country in what you might call making the two requirements, that is the interests of the headquarters, UNDP and so on, and the interests of the country come together in a common program. And it was called the country program, and this was my contribution there. An epoch-making change in the way things worked. We changed over to regional bureaus. It might be of interest to know that following our example, the World Bank also went on to regional bureaus. Till that time, the World Bank had no such arrangement. So the World Bank applied for funds for a program. If they liked it, they gave you the money. Otherwise, they said, no, thank you. We don't think this is a good enough project to us. So the entire system was changed during my time and under my stewardship under Paul Hoffman. And we both retired in 1972 January.
Same time. Now, according to the preamble of the United Nations, one of the important aims of the UN is to save humanity from the scourge of war. But looking at the world since the end of Second World War, though there wasn't any major worldwide war or a nuclear war, still there were many brushfire wars. To what extent would you say that the United Nations has been able to fulfill its obligation on that particular preamble condition?
I'll be glad to answer that question in a more positive way. First of all, as you pointed out, we have been saved a nuclear holocaust. I am not saying that the United Nations did that, but that has happened as a matter of fact. And today we are now discussing the next steps, complete ban on nuclear testing, leading hopefully to a complete nuclear disarmament and so on. But take these brush wars, you are absolutely right. In every case, except Vietnam, in every case, the United Nations has been involved.
Present time Bosnia.
In Bosnia also, we have been involved. I mean,
but not
what
very
is
successfully.
Now, the NATO force is the successor force to the United Nations. We were there first. Wherever there has been a brush fire, we have been able to start the process of establishing ceasefire lines, as it has happened in Cyprus, for example. We have been able to, and very much so in the Middle East. The history of the Middle East would have been different, but for the involvement of the United Nations at every stage. So, to that extent, I used to say the United Nations tries to keep the peace, and where it fails, it's called upon to pick up the pieces. And that's what we have been doing.
Piece them together.
To pick up the pieces and start afresh, to keep the warring countries, so to speak, separated so that they don't fight each other, and to prevent a shooting war. Now that's a very worthwhile example of what the United Nations has been able to do. Now we cannot prevent, for example, sporadic attacks on Israel from northern Israel, south Lebanon. We can't prevent that any more than the presence of policemen can prevent a theft from taking place.
Exactly.
But the policeman has been there, and that presence has been very useful in every case. The United Nations Emergency Force, the United Nations Congo, these were all forces which did their job. Cyprus, we are continuing because the international community chooses to let us continue there to keep a peacekeeping force and so on.